All right, so we're back. We're doing another interview, and today I'm joined with Mark Waid. Mark, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Hold the all good.
um, I just wanted to say I've really been enjoying all the projects you're putting out. I mean, I this is the most DC Comics I've read in a while,
That's
and
nice to hear. Thanks. I'm having a
it's
ball.
yeah. Now just to start, how World's Finest, how did that start? Because it kind of seemed like it was separate continuity, and then it seemed like it was kind of the early stages of the
It
current.
was it was always supposed to be set in just, the past, but still in continuity. Because the moment you start doing stuff out of continuity, readers have this way of like waving their hands, going, "Ah, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't count." So I don't have to read that book. But we've done stuff in most, if not all, of the arcs to tie it back at some point into the main contemporary DC universe. So it really came about because I was back at DC. This is early days of being back at DC, and my editor, just said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, that's my dream job. My dream job, one of my dream jobs at DC is doing a Superman Batman book set in sort of prior times, so we can get into the classic versions of the characters rather than have to worry about moment to moment continuity in the DC universe as it is now." I mean, when I started World's Finest, Superman was in space and Batman didn't even have a Batcave. So, that it would have been very difficult to rally around current continuity at that time.
Right. Now, what is it like working with these characters? Like obviously, I know you love your continuity. I also love continuity. What's it like dealing with 80 plus years of
Yeah,
character history?
it's challenging sometimes, but it's fun. And continuity, I mean, I do like continuity. I do have an appreciation for continuity, but at the same time, I don't feel necessarily beholden by every single story that's been told. I mean, the truth is, and I've done the research on this to back my statement up, there have been more stories told about Batman than about any other character in human history. That's not a joke. It's not an exaggeration. So there's only so much you can do to bring it all together.
Right.
So if we do a new meeting of the Batman Superman team that is not like the very first meeting of the Superman Batman team, which took place on a ocean liner and was all about jewel thieves, that didn't seem, when we retold that story, it didn't seem like a very big case for 2023, Superman and Batman versus a bunch of diamond thieves.
Right. Right. Um, so going back to World's Finest,
Mhm.
did it always start with Dan Mora, or
Yeah.
was it kind of it did? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And honestly, I mean, I knew of Dan Moore's work a little bit just because I follow Grant Morrison's work and they worked together on Klaus, but I wasn't really paying much attention to it. And then when the pages started coming in, I was blown away. I knew my editor had made just the right choice.
Right. Um, because I mean, I was familiar with his work on Detective Comics, and I was like, wow. At the time, I was like, and Jorge, phenomenal artist, Jorge
Yeah,
Jimenez, but I was like, whoa, this Dan Mora guy, like, this is some great stuff.
yeah,
And I think
yeah.
there
He
was
knows what
the
he's doing.
the page he had a page where he was, Batman with the classic kind of blue suit, and I was like, wow, he made that look really cool. Like,
He is one of his great gifts is that he can take anything from any era of DC Comics, no matter how old and clunky it might look in 2024, and make it look cool without changing anything. He just has a gift for it. This is, you know, under his pen, even the oldest characters don't look even remotely hokey or dated. He just has a way, and he doesn't change anything. He just makes them look cool somehow. I don't know what that alchemy is, but I'm all in.
right. I remember in a recent issue of World's Finest, it showed all these different moments of like Jimmy Olsen's history, being with
Yeah,
Superman. And I was just like, wow, like all these kind of hokey concepts just look really cool.
they look really cool. Exactly. Porcupine Jimmy, looks
Right.
really cool. Elastic Lad Jimmy looks really cool when Dan does it. Not many people can pull that off.
Now segueing into Justice League Unlimited, the new series coming out. What can you talk about that?
it was really kind of an extension of what we're doing in World's Finest. The idea was, on an editorial level, the idea was, well, we need another Justice League book because we haven't had a Justice League book for a while, and it's time after all of this stuff to come back. So Absolute Power was designed to lead into that. Absolute Power was a crossover design to sort of show why we really need a Justice League right now. And I think part of the reason Dan and I were tapped is because it really is spiritually a successor to what we're doing in World's Finest. And that with World's Finest, we get to use any and all characters we feel like pulling from the DC universe as long as they're set in the past, right? But that preempts certain characters like Cyborg, for instance, or some of the newer characters that weren't set back then. So this allows us an even deeper pool to draw from. This allows us anybody, and we're going to take advantage of that.
So will it rotate different members in different arcs, or will it have the same members?
It's different. I mean, it's a very mission specific book, and that in that sense, we're taking a nod from the cartoon show Justice League Unlimited. But it's very mission specific in that Red Tornado, who is now the AI who powers the entire Watchtower, and is observing the Earth and paying attention to what the hotspots are. It's his job to go, okay, this is happening in South America. This is giant machinery attacking stuff. So we need the hitters. We need Superman and Wonder Woman or whatever. This is a mystery that's happening somewhere in Bogota. And so that's a Batman job. And so it's mix and match. It's not, there's always two or three things happening in every issue. There's always, an A plot and a B plot and maybe even a little bit of a C plot runner. So that gives me the chance to mix and match characters. And the way I sort of approach every issue, knowing that I have two or three different things happening at once, is I want to make sure that several of the big star characters are in every issue. Not all of them in every issue. But your Superman's, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, Aquaman, Green Lantern, adjacent with Star Sapphire, but still sort of Green Lantern-ish. At least some of them in every issue. That's one level. And then the second level is I want to make sure that the B-listers are given service, the Green Arrows and the Black Canaries and the Mary Marvels or whatever. And then on a third level, I want to try to make sure, whether it's even in just a tiny subplot moment or in the bigger story, to reintroduce you to some older DC character who you may not have ever heard of. And what kind of new spin can we put on that?
Wow. Are there any, can you tease any like D-list, C-list characters that we might see in that, or?
I mean, well, let's see. We've got Dr. Occult, who was DC's first superhero from 1936. He
Okay.
shows up in issue 2, and I liked him so much I put him in issue 3. Um, Airwave, of course, helps carry that first issue, as you've seen in some of the preview art, that he's the perfect point of view character as a gosh, wow, sort of eyes wide open. Wow, I don't know anything about what's going on up here. So he's the reader's point of view, right? On a newer tack, there's Xanthi, who was in Spirit World. That she's in issue 3. So I'm pulling, some of the more obscure ones from the past, some of the ones from the present who may have had like a mini series, but maybe it didn't set the world on fire with sales, but it's a good character. Maybe I can reintroduce that character to a broader audience.
Oh, I can't wait to read it. I'm excited.
Thanks. Good.
Um, so, now obviously you're well established into the industry. How did it start? How did you break into the industry? Like, how did you start doing comics?
I never really had any ambition about being a writer until I was in my mid 20s, honestly. I thought maybe I'd want to be an editor. So I knew I could write nonfiction. I never tried to write fiction as a kid, except little tiny dribs and drabs here and nothing to speak of. Um, and so as a nonfiction writer, I started working for the fanzines of the days, the Amazing Heroes and the Comics Buyers Guides and stuff. For anybody who born after 2000, I mean, the print versions of the websites you see today, if you will. Put my tongue in cheek, but saying that that's what it was. So, working on the fan magazines as a writer and then becoming an editor at Fantagraphics of Amazing Heroes magazine led me to DC as an editor. So I was there for a couple of years. I learned a lot. I learned a ton about writing because I'm working with every writer in the industry. I'm working with, on anthology books with, Neil Gaiman and John Ostrander and Christopher Priest and Len Wein and just like everybody working in comics. And when that came to an end, my editorial stint came to an end. I hadn't made enough contacts up at DC who encouraged me and said, look, try it. I mean, you've done a few, by that time, I'd done a couple of really tiny, small comic book stories. And they said, let's just keep giving it a whirl. And really, it was Brian Augustin, who was my Flash editor, but also one of my best friends, who said, look, let's try it. We're probably going to cancel Flash now that the TV show is gone anyway. So this is 1992. Why don't you take it and see what you can do with it? And the two of us turned it into something. And that seemed to create a career for which I am eternally grateful.
What was the first story you did at DC?
It was all right. Let me back up. So the Superman books before John Byrne came along in 1986 did Man of Steel and revamped everything. The Superman books were under the under the supervisory capabilities of an editor named Julie Schwartz. Julie was uh, he'd been there forever. He'd been at DC at that point for 40 years. He was a literary agent who came aboard DC in 44 and knowing nothing about comics, but he was Ray Bradbury's first agent. He was H.P. Lovecraft's last agent. So he knew fiction, uh, and he came aboard at the behest of one of his friends. Uh, I want to say it was Henry Kuttner, who another science fiction great, who said, "We go up to DC." And so Julie got there and enjoyed the job and stuck with it all these years. And at some point in the early 70s, he was given the Superman line of books to oversee. Now, the thing about Julie is that Julie comes from fandom. Julie was one of the very first science fiction fans in America. It sounds ridiculous to say this to a modern audience, but science fiction as a genre in America didn't even really exist until 1929, 1930, along in there, as science fiction magazines started to appear on American newsstands. Before then, it really wasn't a thing. So for Julie in the late 30s to become one of the half dozen best known science fiction fans around was still a pretty small bar or a pretty low bar to leap over, right? But all this to say, Julie came from fandom. So in the 80s, before Byrne came aboard, the Superman books were kind of bumping along. They were mid-list books. They weren't really DC's best-selling books. But the edict from publishing was, listen, Germany is doing a ton of Superman books over there. Like they reprint our stuff and they reprint it in gobs. And so there's always a huge appetite for that stuff over there. We want you to start treating the Superman comics and Action Comics as sort of suppliers for that sort of stuff. In other words, we want you to do a bunch of 8-page stories and a bunch of 16-page stories, make them self-enclosed, target them towards a younger readership, and not kids, but certainly they don't have to be terribly sophisticated. And that's going to be where we draw the German reprints from. So Julie embraced the job, and in doing so, what he did was he started hiring fans. He started hiring fans who wanted to be professionals. He had a special soft spot in his heart for fans because that's where he came from. So Craig Boldman was a fan who tried writing at DC Comics, and Julie made something out of him. There's a few others, and I was one of the latecomers. And in '84, I pitched a Superman story for Action Comics. It was called, because Julie prefers sort of juvenile sounding titles, it was called the Puzzle of the Purloined Fortress. Sounds corny as hell. It was, even in 1984, it was corny, but it was exactly what the market wanted, right? I'm writing, not necessarily writing my dream Superman story. I'm writing what Julie will publish. So that was my first work in Action Comics 572. And I did another story for Julie a couple of issues later of Action Comics that was just terrible. And he edited it to within an inch of its life. So none of the dialogue is mine. And after that, I tried taking a couple other swings at the Superman character, but at that point, John Byrne was beginning to make his plans. So that era of Superman was going to leave us by. So that's kind of at that point I turned to editorial.
Okay. Now, so I love, binge reading comics, old runs, current runs. I'm sure you do as well.
Oh, sure.
And I'm always like wondering, like, when you're writing,
Mhm.
how much does editorial collaborate with things? Like, are you writing and does editorial say, "Oh, hey, he's doing this in this book. You can't have this character in this book." How does that
I,
process work?
it happens sometimes like that, but if you're smart, like I am, you work things out ahead of time and make sure your editor knows, if not every beat of the story, at least the general idea of where you want to go. So that, I mean, Injustice League is a really good example. All right. I have to coordinate line wide with that because do I want to use this character? Well, maybe, but they're going to be in space for 5 issues or they've lost their powers temporarily or something. So this is stuff I need to know. So editorial is really good about making sure that we're coordinated that way. Uh, very little stuff is handed down editorially. It's more me coming up with ideas and pitching stuff. And once I have a rapport with the editor, it's just much easier. Like Paul Kaminsky's my editor on World's Finest and Justice League, and he just trusts me because he knows I've been doing this for 40 years, and so I know where the guardrails are.
Gotcha.
Um, so I mean, it depends. I mean, I see a lot of scripts from younger writers that come across my desk, and they're labeled like third draft or fourth draft or something. So it doesn't mean some DC editors aren't getting their hands dirty and rolling up their sleeves and sort of getting in there. But by and large, I'm lucky where my scripts basically don't need a whole lot of tweaking and messing with once I've turned them in.
Huh. I was just curious because I have Jeremy Adams has come on and chat with me a few times, and in the recent one I had him on, he got a text from Philip Kennedy Johnson. They were talking about some Green Lantern stuff, and I
Yeah.
was just like, "Oh, that's so cool! I wonder what it is." So
Yeah. Well, that's a part of it too. I mean, Josh Williamson, who's doing the Superman book, Jeremy, uh, all, we all sort of stay in touch with each other. We don't have a regular meeting time or anything like that in this day of Zoom, but we stay in touch. And so even as much as editors help us coordinate stuff, we tend to coordinate stuff ourselves as well.
I it's amazing. Like Josh Williamson, just seeing like how, I know he did some work before Flash, but just seeing how much Flash has moved his career to him doing
Yeah.
events, to doing Superman.
Apparently Flash does that for the right people. Yeah.
Right. And it's just great because so I'm a massive Flash fan, and your run actually was what started me on a path to reading every Flash issue I
Oh, cool.
could.
Thank you.
Um yeah, I love it. It's one of my favorite runs.
Thank you.
And between like your run, Jeff's run, and Josh's run, and even Jeremy's run, there's like a
Hmm.
synergy where it's like, oh, if you just read those, you get the picture of the character. And I always
Yeah.
recommend it in that order to people. So,
Thanks.
um, are there any creators, any books you're really enjoying right now from DC that you're like, oh wow, this is great stuff?
Oh, sure. I mean, outside of DC in general, my go-to answer is always anything Grant Morrison's doing. But he's not doing anything for DC right now. But I'm enjoying what Jeremy's doing in Green Lantern. I'm enjoying what Josh is doing in Superman very much. I look forward to what Tom Taylor is going to be doing with Detective Comics, Batman in Detective Comics. I've really enjoyed his Nightwing. Philip Kennedy Johnson is great. There's Josie Campbell's doing a terrific job on Shazam. Like you, I'm reading more DC comics now than I have in a long, long time, and I'm enjoying them.
Like just seeing like the all in banner with these
Yeah.
covers with the white backgrounds, it's just like, you look at all the creative teams, you're like, wow, I gotta pull that, I gotta pull that, I gotta pull that. It's like it's a
It,
great time. And the last time I felt this way was probably DC Rebirth.
yeah.
Just the excitement of like, oh, this is fresh, this is jumping on point.
Yeah. exactly.
amazing creative teams.
We're very lucky that way. And again, part of that is because DC, again, as a general rule, I'm sure that some writers would tell me I'm wrong, but from what I can see as a general rule, DC is a very creative friendly company.
Right.
DC is tends to be sort of a, you know, come to us with what you want to do, and we'll try to help make that work for you if we can.
Um, I wanted to kind of go back to Flash a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Y- I read in the back of, I think it was the last trade of your run, that you had that one time
Story.
travel
Right.
Wally story. I was always just curious. That was one of the top things I wanted to ask you.
I mean, I may as well tell you because it's been used so many times now in since I mean that was 20 years ago.
Right,
So in those past 20 years, I've seen this basic plot show up here and there in different media. And so the basic idea was going to be that Wally as a kid was witness to a horrible accident where some childhood friend of his was killed. And against Barry's wishes, he decides to get on the cosmic treadmill and go back in time and try to save the kid's life. And he manages, but then something else happens, and he tries again and again. And it's just like he's again and again and again. He's making leap after leap after leap back in time, and there's always something that sort of like the hand of fate is just mocking him and having him come to the conclusion at the end of it all that, and damn it, there's, I mean, there's certain things you can't do. There's certain history things you can't change. And it's sobering for Wally, but it also makes him resent time travel quite a bit.
right. I see what you're saying. Like that trope has been done in other
It
mediums.
has.
I
It
get
hadn't been
it
done when I came up
over
with the
time.
idea, sadly, but it's been done, a lot since. I think too much for me to, unless I find some new spin on that. But I think that's ground that's pretty well trod by now.
I saw recently, I think I saw like a tweet or an Instagram post that you don't see yourself ever revisiting Flash going back to is that true or
It's true. I mean, he'll show up in Justice League, but
right?
the problem with going back to something you've done before is that people aren't just, especially if it's popular, is that people aren't comparing you to your work back then. They're comparing you to their nostalgia for
Mm.
your work back then. So I know when I came back and did a 6 issue run on Flash in the, when was it, early 2000 or early
Oh, it was the
2000, mid 2000?
Wild
Yeah.
West
Right.
with the
Boy, I
kids.
mean, it was not well received. It was sort of, well, this isn't like what Mark's earlier Flash stuff. It's true, it wasn't. I'm a different writer now, and I'm not trying to do karaoke, and I'm just trying to do something new. And it just wasn't terribly well received. I don't think it was a bad story, and it certainly was still Wally. But I just think that the danger is people are looking at it and going, it's not as good as his old stuff because it's everybody's knee jerk reaction, even me. Sometimes you look at some singer or comedian or whatever, like, not as good as his old stuff. When it maybe it is, but you're, like I said, you're competing with nostalgia.
So how do you feel about like the character, just as a whole? I mean, that really launch padded your career and
Yeah.
the show, and it borrowed so many ideas that you had, just or storylines.
Hmm.
How do you like view the character? I know like Superman's your favorite DC
Right. But I will
character,
always
but
have a special attachment to Wally, obviously. I mean, he's the commonality that I found with him. This is part of being a writer. Part of being a writer is finding some commonality with the character, whether it's a villain or a hero or sporting character, whatever, just finding some piece of you in there somewhere that you can relate to. And with Wally, I didn't have anything going in, but I thought about it and I realized the real commonality between us, besides the fact that we're both impatient, is Wally is the fan who made good, right? All he ever wanted to do was be the Flash. And then he got to be the Flash. He's the first person in DC's history, the first hero in DC history to be the generational, literally stepping into the boots of his predecessor. And I was the fan who made good. I wanted to be in comics somehow, and then I was. And I realized that was sort of something I could share with Wally. And that led to me embracing that character and I think really making it mine for a long time. And I'm amazed by the TV show. I love the TV show, especially the first few seasons. I like what Josh has done. I like what Jeremy has done a lot. I I feel like it's still Wally even after all this time.
Right. I felt like with Jeremy's run, you could it really felt like your Wally, which was like,
Yeah, it
oh,
did. It
awesome.
did. Yeah,
It felt like like he got the voice, like,
he really got the
which
voice. He did. Yeah,
you can't say that for there's always going to be those runs where like you're like, oh, that doesn't sound like Batman quite right, doesn't sound like this
yeah.
character. But it was like, oh, this feels like Wally, and I felt like, as someone that has read monthly that character, I was like,
Mhm.
it really caught my attention. I was like, oh, interesting.
Yeah,
So,
that's, I mean, with, I was really impressed by what Jeremy had done. That means, clearly as a kid, he was reading my stuff, which makes me feel ancient. But at the same time, I'm flattered that he took something away from it.
what's your take on like Barry Allen eventually returning? Do you think that kind of cheapens maybe a little bit of that time he was absent? I'm just curious what your take is on that.
I mean, I think they've done a lot of good and interesting things with that character. If it had been up to me at the time, I never would have brought him back because I felt like he had a gracious end. I felt like he had become DC's first official saint. That there were more good stories told about Barry in the 20 years after he died than in the 10 years before he died. And but at the same time, I get it. There was a movement at DC at that time to plug Hal Jordan back into the costume, to plug Barry Allen back. There was this sort of nostalgia run movement at DC that I had nothing to do with, that was bringing these characters back. And I think that they've managed to acquit themselves nicely. And I think that the fact that Rebirth once more made room for Wally and Barry, and especially when Jeremy came aboard and said, okay, it's going to be Wally and we'll put Barry over here. And now, after Absolute Power, Barry seems to have lost his powers. And so I have a specific role for him in Justice League coming up, and a specific role for him in another project that we haven't announced yet. So there's still room for Barry. I just don't know if there's room for Barry the Speedster.
Interesting. That was the big thing, and I just want to let you know I loved Absolute Power. I
Thank you.
really enjoyed it.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad you had you had a DC like an event like this before? I don't really recall it.
The last one was Underworld Unleashed, and that
Right.
was a billion years ago. So no, I mean 52 kind of, but it's not the same as a crossover event. And I was only one of the architects there. But yeah, Absolute Power was the first time I'd taken a swing at something like that in a long, long time.
As like a fan, I saw, what Jeff did with Infinite Crisis, and then what Grant did with Final Crisis. I always thought I was like, I want Mark's Crisis, and I felt like I loved how there was no crisis in the title, but it was like it
Right.
still felt
It
the
still felt
the
like
the,
that. Yep.
the gratitude. It was like this is it. I've been
Yeah.
asking for this. With Dan Mora, I was like, this is awesome.
Oh, it was a joy. I mean, it really was I mean, it was a lot of work, but it was a joy. And I think we acquitted ourselves pretty well, certainly because Dan made it look amazing.
And it just felt so. It felt so like relatable in the time of AI and just the news.
Yeah.
I was just like, it was one of those books that I was like, I would give to like my dad to be like, oh, check
Oh,
this out.
cool.
And I don't really
Cool.
recommend my dad a lot of comics these days, but I was like, oh, this is something I would definitely recommend to check out. Even if
What
you
do you
had
think?
I never asked him if he read it.
Then
I should
let's just
ask him.
assume he loved it. Let's just assume he loved it, and
Yeah.
then just
Yep.
don't ask. Let's just assume he loved it. Well, I'm sorry, I stepped on your next question. What were you going to say?
Oh, I kind of spaced it out, but Batman and Robin Year One. I'd love to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about that.
sure. I mean, that came mostly from Chris Samnee's brain. I mean, he's been wanting to do. He loves Batman like I love Superman. He's wanted to draw Batman books since he was a kid, and he'd been pitching stuff at DC for a long time, but he was never catching the right editor at the right time with really great ideas. It just, through no fault of his, stuff wasn't coming together. And he called me up and said, "You want to do something together?" And I didn't really have time. I'm so busy, but I'm not going to say no to Chris. I'm going to make time for that. So, I said, we need to do it the way we did Black Widow more than we did Daredevil. Daredevil was full scripts. Black Widow was more us getting on the phone and knocking ideas back and forth, and me turning in a skeletal plot for him to sort of pace out and turn into a story, and then I go back and do dialogue. And I said, if we can do that, I can make time for that, and I'm definitely in. And so we started to talk about what we wanted to do, and we came up with a bunch of ideas, but none of them really felt like they were big. And the goal was to try to find some take that wasn't like, oh, here's the fifth Batman book that DC's doing this month over, like it's just another miniseries. And when we landed on doing a year one concept, Batman and Robin year one, that clicked. And suddenly we had our story.
Well, the art, Chris Samney art was amazing, but I
Yeah.
I actually wanted to check if
Yeah.
Dick Grayson's first villain was Two-Face after reading that. I was like, I need to check this because
It's
the continuity junkie in me.
right. And now we get back to continuity, and we're kind of squinting a little bit because, I mean, in comics, no, in comics, Joker would have been his first supervillain, but in like the original 1940 comics. But since then, so many different takes on Batman's early years have been done over and over again that even I'm not sure I can tell you whether or not the Penguin was around when Dick Grayson was starting out or whether he came later. Um, so I
Right.
we're that's a case where we're sort of playing a little fast and loose.
Yeah, it's funny just how like the continuity works where things get retconned. And I always wonder also, how do you deal with that? Because you never want to like offend someone like, oh, I retold that origin.
Right.
I'm always just curious like how that is too. Like,
I mean, I try to dance between the raindrops as much as I can. That's a Tom Brevoort phrase, but it just means try to honor what's there and try to go in between the moments rather than have to wholesale revise everything. I know Scott Beatty, who'd written Robin Year One, was concerned. He was because it was his magnum opus, and he was afraid that we were just kind of coming, going to ramshackle over it and bulldoze over it. And I had to call him and say, no, no, I've read Robin Year One. I really like Robin Year One. Not every tiny little bit of detail is going to match up, but I'm working to try not to undo anything that you did if I can help it and yet still serve the story. So I enjoy that challenge. I really do. But at DC, it's much harder than it is at Marvel, like you said, because we've been retconning and retconning and retconning for so long. And some of these stories are 60, 70, 80 years old. So I do what I can.
um, I know we're kind of at like the half hour mark. But I wanted to also mention Fantastic Four. Wow, one of my
Thanks.
favorite runs you did. I'm currently reading the original with Stan and Jack.
No, so good. Yeah.
Love it.
Thanks.
I mean, but there's that scene when they go meet God and it's Jack Kirby. That's probably one of my favorite comic moments. It was just,
Thank you.
I love how you just deconstructed the four and then you
Hmm.
had the king himself put them back together. It was just an
Thank you.
awesome moment.
That
Um,
really felt right to me. And I'm glad that Marvel was okay with that.
because you always you see like these runs where like they put these characters and they tear them down, but this was one of those moments when I was reading I was like the pieces were all apart. I was
Yeah.
like, how do you put it back together for the
Yeah.
next writer? And I was like, I know it's gonna get back. You see there's more
Right.
Fantastic Four comics, but I was like, how is he gonna tie this up? How is he gonna fix it at
Yeah.
the end? And it
And
was just awesome.
my job is to put the toys back in the toy box when I'm done in pretty much the same condition as I took them. It's not, you can make tweaks and changes. I mean, with Wally, obviously I turned him into a different character over the years, sort of, but at the end of the day, with especially the bigger the characters, whether they're Superman or Batman or Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, whatever, you can do as much as you can as a writer within that time frame that you have custody of the character, that it's under your pen. But at the end of the day, you got to put that character back kind of the way you found it, because it's disrespectful to come along and just break a bunch of stuff and then walk away and make somebody else try to figure out how to fix everything.
Was there ever a moment where you picked up a character or a team where you maybe looked at what the previous person did and you were like, oh, well, thanks. Like, how do I get out of the, how do I steer the ship
Daredevil,
now?
dude. Daredevil was it. I mean, Daredevil was as dark and as have to have a drink after every issue as you could possibly. It had turned into that over a succession of writers after Bendis, and they were all good stories. But oh my god, I didn't want to write that character. But DC, or rather Marvel, came to me, and Steve Wacker, the editor, came to me and said, "We don't want you to write that character either. That's fine." But we know what your strengths are, and we want the character to be a little bit more in the superhero realm for a little while. After so many years as a street level character, just go to town. And so, that was a lot of there was a lot of sort of fixing up without ignoring anything that Andy Diggle or some of the other writers who preceded me had done. It just, you lean into it and you move forward.
Um, would you say is like your favorite kind of nod or like live action adaptation of any of your work, whether it be like a character you created or maybe a story arc you did?
I I will say that seeing Impulse show up on my TV screen is just so completely delightful to me, especially because he looked just the costume is exactly Bart's costume. And
Right.
same with Jenny Ognatz from XS from Legion of Superheroes, which created with I'm sorry, I'm having a senior moment. I'm so embarrassed. Tom McCraw.
Yeah.
Uh and so seeing those characters come to life, those are the those are the best moments. But when I think about it for a second and really answer the question, there is a moment that is captured on film somewhere. I don't have the photo, but at the moment, because somebody else has this photo and needs to send it to me again. There is a photo of me in the moment that I hear the word Speed Force on the Flash TV show for the first time, and the word Speed Force is mentioned, and I'm over the moon at that point. That's just something that you want as a creator, as somebody who works with these characters, and as somebody who invests in these characters, both as a fan and as a writer. You want to feel like you've been able to leave something behind with staying power. You want to believe that you've added something to the legend, whether it's the S stands for hope, or this is what the Speed Force is, or whatever. There's precious few of those, but when those moments happen, they're just exciting as hell.
I remember seeing an interview with Dan Slott. I think it was some Spider-Man character I think you had created that maybe
Yeah,
you guys were at a summit or something like that. Can you tell,
yeah,
am I
yeah.
remembering this correctly?
Yeah, you are. J. Jonah Jameson Sr. J. Jonah Jameson's dad was my great contribution to the Spider-Man universe, and disagreed. So I RIP JJJ Sr. It happens, I mean, I can't fault him. It's his character at that point. I've done my stint, but I do miss that character. I thought that was a really good addition and a unique addition to the Spider-Man universe.
So what happened? Were you at a summit or something? And then he was like, I am, we're gonna kill him off.
Yeah, and I spoke up loud. I mean, I like Dan, but I mean, and we have a really good friendly relationship. I wasn't mad so much as just, do you really have to do that? And he convinced me that the story needed it, and that's where we are. So I don't. It's not a beef. It's not a feud, anything like that. It's just,
Of
it
course.
happens sometimes. And sometimes I'm sure I've done it to other creators too, whether I've done it by accident. I have been done it by accident. I never go out and spite and change something that somebody else had set up in the past. But sometimes you're kind of back in that corner where, not every aspect of this retelling is going to jibe exactly with your original concept or what have you. Everybody has those moments. That's part of being the custodian of the character for any length of time. It's going to happen.
Um, I'm sure, I don't know if you were a part of it, the Kingdom Come documentary with
No,
Alex Ross. You weren't a part of it?
no, had nothing to do with it. I was interviewed for a couple of small snippets, but other than that, I have nothing to do with it. So I hope people enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I love Kingdom Come and I love it. It's not, I feel like people misinterpret what it is sometimes.
In what sense?
Well, I feel like a lot of people talk about it like, oh, this is the last DC story. And I'm like, I never read
I
it
don't.
like that.
Right. It's just it's not supposed to be the last
No,
DC story. This is when every time there was a trend in the early 2000s where DC writers would sort of start pulling in that direction for their in continuity and modern day stories. They started pulling toward the Kingdom Come reality, and I'm like, no, don't. It's a cautionary fable. It's not meant to be this way. This is the bad version of how the DC universe ends. So don't go there. So we seem to have that seems to have abated over the years.
I always think of it as, and correct me if I'm wrong, reflection of the 90s,
Oh
like
yeah,
the extreme um, 90s of comics. Like it was kind of like, all right, the original heroes are coming back and we're going to put you in your place. I
oh yeah.
always
It was
interpret it like that.
very much Alex and me taking the piss out of the Image Comics characters of the day, which were all giant guys with big guns and women with huge tits and not and names like bondage or chainmail or whatever, and that don't even really have anything to do with their name. So we just had a lot of fun taking the piss out of those guys.
Um, so I'm sure when you saw Superman with, I always consider it the Kingdom Come Superman logo. What was
Right.
your thoughts on that when you saw it for James Gunn's Superman?
Very happy with that. I mean, I'm sure it doesn't have much to do with Kingdom Come other than that, but I don't care. I loved it there. I loved it when they used the Kingdom Come Superman in the CW shows and
Right. Yeah.
that big Crisis crossover. That was just so much fun. And boy, Brandon Routh is, I maintain, a terrific Superman who got stuck in a terrible movie.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. And seeing him again wearing, that suit, I was like, man, we
Yeah,
need a series or something of
I know,
him.
but I feel bad for him because it's like it's the last guy in the world that DC's ever going to give a Superman movie to after what happened with Superman Returns. But but I love what he's done.
I think of him kind of like the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man of the Superman.
Oh yeah, true. Yes, you're right. That's good.
Well, Mark, I thank you so much for joining me for this. I really so happy to talk with you. You're one of my favorite creators. I actually
Thank you.
met you at Terrificon, and that's
Right.
how this
Yes, I remember.
started.
Yeah. Yep. And it's
Um,
a great show. By the way, great show. If anybody's listening to this and ever is on the fence about whether or not they want to go to Terrificon in Connecticut, cannot recommend it highly enough. Terrific show.
Love it. Yep, I go every year.
Yep.
But I want to say goodbye to you properly, so I'm
Sure.
going to end the recording.
Okay. All right. Take care.